and declares, some men came bringing to him, that is to Jesus, a paralytic carried by four of them. In other words, Jesus was back in Capernaum, and there were four men who heard the news that Jesus is down at Peter's house preaching, teaching, and changing people's lives. And they decided that they were going to go down and worship. They were going to go down and get a word, and they were going to go down and be in the presence of the Lord in the flesh. However, they knew of a man with the palsy, a paralytic who was paralyzed and unable to move. This man was a man who needed a healing. This was a man who needed a change. This was a man who needed a miracle. This was a man who needed to be touched by Jesus. However, instead of merely strolling down to Peter's house alone, instead of getting a word for themselves and going home once they were blessed, they decided to take this man, the paralytic man, to Jesus. In other words, these four men were men who cared enough about somebody else to the degree that they were willing to sacrifice themselves, inconvenience themselves, and extend themselves to help somebody who was in need of a blessing. What a blessing it is, beloved, to have men who know what it means like to be a man who knows how to care for another man. These brothers noticed the man's condition. He was paralyzed and he was physically unable to move. And I suspect and I can imagine, and I would not be surprised to know that because of this man's physical condition, this man was a man whose life was spiritually broken as well. The fact of the matter is, there is something about a man who is unable to bring home the bacon, unable to contribute to his home, unable to stand on his own 2 feet, unable to be the head of his house, unable to be the king of his castle, and unable to influence his own destiny, that leaves the man battered, beat down, bruised, and broken. However, there is something special, there is something wonderful, there is something marvelous, there is something remarkable and something radical about a man who sees the plight, who sees the condition, and sees the predicament of a man who is broken, and the man who is whole is able to relate, is able to cover, is able to minister to, and ultimately able to care for his brother who is in trouble. These men cared enough to do something about the paralyzed man's condition. They didn't sit around talking about how awful it was that this man was paralyzed. They pooled their resources together in order to show in a tangible way that I care for my brother. These men cared enough to do something about the paralyzed man's condition, to do something about his circumstances, and to help him in a crisis. So they worked together to bring the man to Jesus. I wonder this morning how many of us care enough about each other to help like these men, like these four men do in our lesson. I wonder how many of us are not afraid to get close enough to each other this morning in order to let each other know that we have needs that have not been met. We have pain in our lives that is hurting us, and we have an understanding that our plight in life is broken, and we do this because we know that God has somebody somewhere who is willing to reach out, touch, and make a difference in our lives. I wonder how many of us really care enough about our brothers and our sisters who are entrapped by circumstances beyond their control. Instead of sitting back, judging them, scorning them, mocking them, and disrespecting them, we instead care enough to take every opportunity, to take every effort, and make meaningful sacrifices in order to let our sons and let our daughters, let our our fathers, let our mothers, let our youth, and let our elderly know, both in word and deed, I really do care for you. Specifically speaking to the men in our midst this morning, I wonder how many of us could imagine how different our plight in life may have been if there was a man in our lives who cared for us in this way. I wonder how many of us are not afraid to witness and testify to the fact that our lives have been blessed, our lives have been enriched, and our lives have been deepened because God placed a caring man in our lives. I wonder how many of us are willing to admit that one of the reasons why so many of our men are not where God wants them to be is because we have not taken the time to learn and to teach and display what true manhood is really about. True manhood is not about pushing your chest out. It's not about flexing your muscles. A real man can show that I love you. I care for you. Could you imagine where you would be today if God hadn't taken the time to raise up and lead some caring man or some caring woman who was willing to take the time and expend the energy to throw us a lifeline? Some of us even can even begin to imagine where we would be if God had not raised up mama, daddy, grandma, granddad who was willing to drag us to church, make us go to Sunday school. Can you imagine where we would be if some caring person did not make us sit up straight, spit your gum out, stop passing notes, fix your clothes, look presentable, go upside our heads when we talk back or rolled our eyes, sucked our teeth, cut school, or when we were found somewhere we should have not been? Can you imagine where we would be if God didn't have a man in our lives who told us that to be a man is to be somebody who cares about himself and cares about his family and cares about his life? The point that our lesson is making is that God did not save us for ourselves. God saved us so that our lives could be a blessing to somebody else. Somebody who is hurting, somebody who is sinking, somebody who is simply trying to keep their heads above water. I am convinced this morning that if we really want to experience revival in our communities, what we need is we need some men who are not ashamed to stand up and say, I care about you. Lord can use some men who are willing to go into the hedges and to the highways. Or if you're like me, if you're a city boy, God can use some men who are willing to go into alleyways, hang out on street corners, stand at the bus stop,